Good evening and welcome to He's Alive 40 Days of Preaching, Teaching, and Prayer. We are broadcasting tonight from Spokane Valley, Washington, from Spokane Valley SDA Church, and we are so glad that you are here, whether it's through our audience or whether it's through media. We are just thankful that you have decided to join us tonight. He's Alive is celebrating 25 years of broadcast ministry, and what better way to celebrate than to come in and talk about the meaning of ministry, talk about the purpose of ministry. So we are so thankful. So the reason and purpose that we're here is that speakers are coming from all over the country, and they're coming to share with us about ministry, their own experience, the things that have happened in their own ministries, and to share purpose and thought and practical ideas and practical tips on ministry. Anything from family or marriage ministry, anything from children's ministry, service to our community, men's ministry, women's ministry, health ministry, prayer ministry. So the whole range and disciplines of ministry we will be covering in this 40 days. We are actually tonight on night number 15, and we are so thankful that Jim Brackett is here with us tonight. Now, for the past 2 nights, he has shared with us on diabetes. He shared with us just on health and how to cure and just take care of our bodies. So we're thankful for that. He began our health emphasis as he came in on Friday evening, and we're going to end up with Rico Hill coming in to join us. We're going to also end up with Charmaine Vieira that's going to be sharing with us as well. So we're excited for this actually week of health emphasis. And so hopefully we can garner and gain from what, if God is calling you to a health ministry, some of the things that you can do to be able to share on health. I want to mention as well guardrails. We've talked once again about guardrails. Guardrailsmedia.com. This is a social community that He's Alive is putting together where all of this information will be banked. So each evening that you will hear with us tonight will be on that social community. You can go back and revisit what has been played or what has been broadcasted. It will be banked and housed there, as well as YouTube and Facebook. So remember, if you go to guardrailsmedia.com, you can register there as an individual. You can register there as a church community that can come and just have wonderful resources to help build up your ministry in the kingdom of God as we are in the very last days. I also want to place an emphasis on our prayer focus. It's going to start December 26th, and it's going to run through January 3rd. We're going to have a wonderful time bringing in the new year of prayer focus. Randy Maxwell will be visiting with us. He has written the book. The most familiar one that I am familiar with is If My People. He will be here. We're excited about that. And then we will have the ministerial director from Oklahoma Conference. He's also the prayer coordinator. He will be visiting us with us during that time as well. So we're just excited for that prayer focus. Make sure that you share with your friends. Also, I want to remind you that you can revisit each thing that is being broadcasted on guardrailsmedia.com. The other thing that I wanted to remind you is that you can revisit not just there, but also on Facebook. You can go to He's Alive and visit on Facebook and find all of the broadcasts, and also on YouTube. It's He's Alive Television on YouTube. Remember that you can go back and revisit our broadcast there. Once again, I want to thank you so much for being here with us. At this time, I just want to welcome Jim Brackett as he shared so much information with us. We thank him so much for being here with us.
Good evening. Thank you for being with us this evening. We're going to treat a topic tonight that's a challenge. It's kind of a scourge in our country, the issue of cancer. You know that when I started in this work, my wife and I 42 years ago, 1 person out of 12 in their lifetime would be diagnosed with cancer of some kind. As recently as just several years ago, that number had increased to 1 person out of 4. And recently it's been published that now 1 out of every 3 Americans in their lifetime will be diagnosed with some kind of cancer. It's an amazing story, but there's a lot that we can do about it. There's very good news, actually, that we're going to be looking at. First of all, just the way things that we could do to prevent cancer. It's quite remarkable. The the number one risk factor, this is amazing. This has only been published in the last couple of years. The number one risk factor for cancer today is too many pounds, overweight. The highest risk factor there is, and of course you know, almost 70% of Americans are overweight, so it's a very big factor in this issue. There's the issue of activity, or some people like to use the word exercise. I avoid it because it scares people. That's a very interesting contributor to preventing cancer. A colonoscopy. There was a time, it's been quite a few years ago when when we were first in this work, that the number one killer of black men was colon cancer. The number two killer of white men was colon cancer. Today, because of colonoscopies, that can be about 95% of colon cancer can be avoided if people will go to the gastroenterologist and have a colonoscopy done. Another big factor, as you will see in a minute, is plant-based food. This would be unrefined, non-animal sources or plant-based sources. And as you'll see, there's a special emphasis on soy in that world. Then alcohol, published by the IARC, the International Association for Research on Alcohol, has published recently that even one drink of alcohol and every drink of alcohol increases the risk for cancer. Amazing when so many people in this country are involved in using alcohol. Virginity and monogamy, particularly, of course, for cervical cancer. If this is rare, I understand that today, but if a young couple decide to be chaste until they're married and faithful to one another, the chance of the woman getting cervical cancer is virtually zero. It is a sexually transmitted disease. Believe it or not, the use of caffeine. Now, there's many people, 80% of Americans are addicted to caffeine, mainly through coffee, but of course energy drinks and so forth are included in this addiction. And it actually 2 cups of coffee a day doubles the risk of bladder cancer, 2.5 times the risk of colon cancer, which hopefully this would be caught, as we said, with colonoscopies. That's an issue. Stress is an issue in terms of cancer. We have heredity. I'll show you a lot of interesting details about that this evening. We can't do much about the heredity, but there are things that if we know ahead of time that can be done that we'll look at. Believe it or not, it has been shown in studies that laughter is a factor in preventing cancer. There's some very interesting stories, of course, about people laughing together. Smoking cessation. Tobacco, certainly, it's believed that marijuana will probably prove to be the same. I think you're all aware, all of our listeners are aware that there has been wonderfully a tremendous reduction in smoking in this country. When I was a young speaker, 52% of Americans were smoking tobacco. Today that has been reduced, listen to this, to less than 18% on an average. And in some categories of persons and age groups, it's even much less than that. So there's a lot we can do to prevent cancer. The good news about getting cancer is that we can make it grow slow, and we'll look at that, of course, here in detail. Now, many people are unfamiliar with what we might call the phases of cancer. I think everybody listening understands that cancer begins in one of our own cells. A cell, and I'll describe briefly how this happens, becomes cancerous. The average cancer, and there are many different kinds, there's 100 different kinds of cancer. The average cancer cell will take 100 days before it copies itself. That's over 3 months. Another 100 days go by before those 2 copy, so we now have 4 cells after about 7 months. This is called the doubling time. A more aggressive cancer has a shorter doubling time and so forth. But it normally would take about 9 years before that cell that became cancerous produced a tumor the size of a period at the end of a sentence. Still very difficult to diagnose, very difficult to image because of that, of its tiny nature. By 10 years, that little tumor has become the size of a pencil eraser, which is now big enough to palpate and certainly large enough to image. Here's the horrible news. It is almost never the case that by the time those 10 years have passed, cells, this is a double negative, have not gotten away. That is to say, the cancer growth will have metastasized, sent cells around the body before it's ever diagnosed. This is the very difficult news. John McDougall gave a lecture I listened to, it's been several years ago now, The Fallacy of Early Detection, in which he spoke of what I have just described and saying it is almost never the case but what this thing has spread. So here are the phases. Initiation, because of a sequence of mutations. This word mutation means a change in the DNA, which I'll be describing in a moment. A cell becomes cancerous. There's no exception to this. Cancer is always the result of mutations in the DNA, usually a sequence or a series of them. Then there becomes what we call promotion. There's an H missing there. I didn't notice that till just now. When a growth promoter, this is very interesting. Cancer virtually never grows without a growth promoter. Now, a growth promoter can be different things. Most everybody that's listening to me this evening, or if you happen to see a rebroadcast, knows, watch me put quotes around that word, that asbestos causes cancer. That actually is not the case. Asbestos is a growth promoter. For example, most people know that a smoker who is exposed to asbestos, we see a much higher incidence of lung cancer. But it is not that the asbestos caused the cancer. The cancer was there, not growing until it was exposed to asbestos. The same with mesothelioma in the lining of the lung. Asbestos does not cause that cancer. It's a growth promoter. And one of the things about a plant-based regimen, which I already mentioned this evening, and is the underlying principle in all that we study, is that we avoid many growth promoters when we use plants for food instead of animal products. You'll see that in several ways here this evening. It's quite remarkable, this issue of growth promotion. Progression is when a tumor sends cancer cells away from the tumor, some of which become new tumors. Everybody sort of knows that prostate cancer usually metastasizes to the bones. That's not because the cancer cell left and went right to a bone somewhere. Those cells go all over the body. Most of them die. Once in a while, one will find a way to live, and that is more common for prostate cancer cells to manage to survive in bone than anywhere else. By the time that man is near death, there's probably cancer growing everywhere in his body. But it usually starts in the metastasizes to the bones, we say, not because it just wanted to go there, but because that's the place where it is most likely that cell would survive. So a big issue is finding ways to limit promotion. Many of you are aware, I think, that are listening, that one of the big issues in breast cancer, and certainly in prostate cancer as well. By the way, 40,000 women die every year in this country from breast cancer. 34,000 men die every year in this country from prostate cancer. These are big issues. But it has become understood that one of the things we're struggling with in the medical community is we overdiagnose these things. What that means is that we saw a cancer, let's say, either in the prostate or the breast, and maybe that cancer is not going to grow. Some of you ladies have heard about something called DCIS, ductal carcinoma in situ. Fancy words that mean that thing is sitting there, but it's not growing. It's just there, but it's not growing. And the problem, of course, is to know whether that thing that was found there is going to grow or not. Same thing with prostate cancer. I'll have a slide on that a little later. It's quite a big issue about this overdiagnosis. And here's an interesting story about soy. I'm going to read this to you. You can read it with me. The elders in Okinawa have repeatedly been shown to be, we're talking about the older men, shown to have the healthiest and longest lived people in the world. This was demonstrated conclusively in the renowned Okinawa Centenarian Study, a 25-year study sponsored by the Japanese Ministry of Health. The researchers conducting this study analyzed the diet and the health profiles of these elders. They concluded that, notice this, high soy consumption is one of the main reasons that Okinawans are at extremely low risk for hormone-dependent cancers, including breast, prostate, ovary, and colon. It goes on. Compared to North Americans, they have a staggering 80% less breast cancer and prostate cancer, and less than half the ovarian cancer and colon cancer, which they believe this enormously reduced risk arises in part, the study authors say, from the Okinawans' large consumption of the isoflavones. Those are some of the phytochemicals found in plants. The lowest cancer rates in the world are found in the Okinawans who consume the most soy. But the other issue is, of course, they get their food from plants, which is a very, as I've said already this evening, an underlying principle. I meant to go back to that, and I'm going to have to try. Well, I'll do it here. Other studies have confirmed the link between soy consumption and reduced cancer risk. The Japan Public Health Center study found the lowest breast cancer rates in women who ate the most soy. And let me see if I can get our slides together here. A recent study showed in the British Medical Journal that women who ate the most flavonoids had a substantially lower risk of breast cancer than those who had a lower intake. So we see this kind of thing everywhere we go. Perhaps the most telling, a huge study published in the Journal of the National Cancer Institute in 2003 found that women with a high intake of soy reduced their risk of breast cancer by what? 54% compared to women with a low intake of soy. Now, I've spent a lot of time in my life trying to get people away from the idea that there's some miracle food. And I don't want you even to think that soy is a miracle food. The point is, if we eat plants, we have the best thing we can do, and you'll see that more as we go along this evening. Soy seems to help tip the scale a little bit, but we see the use of unrefined plants being the largest issue that we have. Well, recently I was visiting with a friend, a physician, whose husband passed away. Now, I have lectured with this lady for years all over this country. We speak frequently on the phone, and we talk a lot about cancer prevention. And one day her husband was diagnosed with cancer. Within about 4 years, he was laid to rest. After he died, about a year, we were traveling together, and I said to her, "What did you do? You know, there's a lot of therapies out there." She said, "We tried everything." And I began to ask her, had she done this and had she done that? And these are some of the things that she had tried to save her husband. She used turmeric. She used resveratrol, this stuff found in red grapes. They tried hyperbaric. They used supplements. They used juicing. They used raw foods. And she finally turned to me and she said, "We don't have the answer." I have encouraged for 45 years people to go to her institute if they had cancer, but in reality, we don't have the answer for a cure. But we do have some answers for prevention, and we have some answers for making it grow slow. I think you'll find this very, very interesting. Now, I've got a diagram here that I drew. It represents the ladder that I call it a ladder. I think most of you know that our DNA is very much like a ladder, that you grab the top and bottom and twist them in opposite direction. You get this thing we call the double helix. I have a drawing or two to show you. But I've flattened it out to try to illustrate something. The ladder has rungs. The rungs are actually made up of 2 half rungs, and that's why I have the colors to just illustrate that. They're not colored. There's 4 kinds of rungs. There are, they're actually chemicals. I'm not going to bother you with the names, but most people use the first letter of each of those chemicals to designate a rung. And the order of the rungs determines the color of your eyes, etc., 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 and the chance of your getting cancer. I still remember perhaps 1976, sitting in my office reading a scientific journal, and a female scientist reported that she had found a gene which, if expressed, I'll tell you what that means, would cause the cell that gene was in to become cancerous. Now, you got to have some background. I have a whole hour-long lecture on what I'm going to share with you in 3 minutes or less. But nevertheless, this ladder that we have is actually broken up into 23 ladders. Everybody knows the word chromosome. And there is a total of 3,200,000,000 rungs in the total ladder. And genes are a part of that ladder. Most of the ladder is not gene. When the scientists recently sequenced the DNA, which means the order of the letters, imagine a book. I can show you a picture. A man is looking at a book, great big book. There's 10 of them to get it all in, and there's nothing but rows and rows and rows of A's and T's and G's and C's. 3,200,000,000 listed. That's the order of the rungs in your and my DNA. And when they did that sequencing from the year 2000 to 2010, cost them $1 billion. Today you can get your own genome sequence. That's the whole ladder. Genome is a word we use for that. You can get it sequenced for less than $100. It's crazy. The advancement of science cost them $1 billion to do the first one in 10 years. And you can get this almost overnight now. In any case, they learned that a small proportion of the ladder was gene, but nevertheless, a gene, they only found 20,000 of them. A gene starts at a certain place in the ladder and ends in a certain place, and that's what I'm trying to describe with this little black arrow. This two little arrows hooked together. And this lady found this gene, which she said would cause the cell to become cancerous, but learned later that the gene was inactivated. In other words, the body was not using it. The cell was not, the gene in which this cell was located was not being used to make a protein. I didn't tell you this. I'll bet you could ask 30 people on the street, what does a gene do? They don't know. It's terrible how much we don't know about our bodies. But nevertheless, I'll tell you, a gene is used by a cell in your body. The gene has the information to make a certain protein. You could say it has the pattern to make the protein. And that's what, when we say the gene was expressed, that's what we mean. The cell would use that gene to make a protein. But she found that the gene, as time went by, was inactivated. So she called it, in the beginning, she called it an oncogene, about cancer. When they learned that the gene was inactivated, they decided to call it something else. They're going to now call it a proto-oncogene, which is a funny word for most of the public. Scientists love this word. It means it's on its way, but it's not there yet. Interestingly enough, they learned as the research continued that if a certain rung got changed, now this is a mutation. You all know the word. You might not have known what it meant. But I told you that these rungs are made of two half rungs, and an A is always hooked to a T, and a G is always hooked to a C. But it's possible, and we'll get into this in a minute, for those things to be changed. And if a certain change was made in that gene, then it would become an oncogene and cause cancer to take place. And as they studied this thing, so now we're going to call it an oncogene only. As they studied this thing, they found something fascinating. This was already now, it's going to be almost 40 years ago that this was learned. There was another gene that they found was keeping this first one from making the cell cancerous. So they decided to call this a tumor suppressor gene. And I don't have that on the screen, but that's what they call it. And this particular gene, they thought it was involved in causing breast cancer. So they named it BR for breast, CA for cancer. Later on, they found another similar one, so they have to name one and another one 2. It turns out they were mistaken. This gene, which provides a pattern to make a protein, and it's that protein actually that suppresses tumor formation. And that protein, it turned out to suppress tumor formation in all of the female reproductive organs and in all one of the male reproductive organs. So it should have been renamed, but of course scientists have a way of, once they name something, they can't get over changing the name. So BRCA1. Some of you ladies, maybe everybody, although you may not have focused on it, they'll say, do you have the cancer gene? It's a funny thing to say. Everybody has this gene. It's virtually never missing. The problem is, this tumor suppressor gene, if it gets mutated, may not be able to do what it's supposed to do. Did I get backwards there? There we go. There's the mutation. No, it didn't do it for me, so I got to go back again here. And in any case, what I was going to show you was this gene, even though on the screen it's only a few rungs long, this gene actually has, and I'm still not getting what I want here. Let's try it again. Oh, there it is. Can you see under the BRCA1 how many rungs are in this gene? 181,000 rungs to make up this gene. And if it gets mutated, it can't prevent the cancer very well. So what I'm going to show you now is a picture of the protein that is made from this gene. The slides on my screen are a little bit different than the ones that are coming on the screen, but this is the same. This picture, this actual of a drawing, or an artist drew this. This is the protein that is made from the BRCA1 gene. You could never tell by looking at it. Now, this is way too small to see with a microscope. But what this thing actually does, it travels along the DNA and fixes the mistakes. I wish you all would have gasped when I said that, because it's amazing what's in our bodies. We have now found a whole string, or a whole bunch, that's a pretty cheap word, of tumor suppressor genes. In other words, without these tumor suppressor genes, everybody would get cancer Babies would get cancer and probably die of cancer maybe even before they were born. But our bodies are filled with these tumor suppressor genes, which make these proteins that go around fixing the DNA. And if you got this together, I said in the beginning, there's no exception to this. All cancer is the result of mutations or changes in the DNA, a sequence usually, that bring about this thing, this terrible thing we call cancer. So there's the 181,000 rungs, and interestingly enough, this thing we call BRCA1 protein fixes the DNA, and that protein has 1,800 plus amino acids in it, hooked together in a long chain, and then folded up into this amazing shape you see, all done inside your cell and my cells. Every cell of your body has this gene in it and can make that protein to try to fix mistakes that turn up in the DNA. Just an amazing story. Now, here is where it's called a tumor suppressor gene, and I say that if there is a mutation in one of these, it might not be able to suppress the tumor or to suppress a tumor occurring. And here's an interesting story. I don't know if you can follow this. Stuff is all pretty complex in a way. Today, in the human population, we have found over 1,900 mutations in this gene. Nobody has them all. But if you looked at all of the genes in the population, you'll find that many different mistakes. And certain people have several of them. Certain people have more or less. I'm not a moviegoer, and I had no idea who this person was. Most of you listening will know that a woman, an actress by the name of Angelina Jolie, found out that her BRCA1 gene, and every gene in every cell in her body has the same mutated gene. She found out that she had inherited from her parents a number of mutations to this gene, so that her chance of getting breast cancer, instead of being 11%, which is what it is in the general population of America, her chances were 87% based on the mutations in the BRCA1 gene. So she decided to have prophylactic surgery, which I think was a very good idea, in my opinion, and hopefully not have cancer in some other place because of these mutations. What causes mutations? Well, radiation is something everybody knows about. X-rays, whether it's for your teeth or for your chest or anywhere else, including, of course, mammograms, although the medical community is working towards finding more non-invasive ways to image the organs and the tumors that might be forming. For example, everybody knows about something called MRI. That is a non-invasive scan. And MRI is quite effective in being able to see cancer tumors. So we're making progress in these areas. Other places that radiation come from, they come from outer space. I don't know if you know this, but we're protected. The magnetic field around the earth. These particles come whizzing toward us and they hit the magnetic field and it bends them away. But some still get in. I don't know if you're aware of this, but even the air protects us. So the higher elevation you live, the more radiation you get from outer space. Pilots who fly for hours every week at 30 to 40,000 feet get quite a bit of extra radiation. So do you when you ride in those planes, but the pilots do it every day. So they get an accumulation of radiation from that. We should avoid all the x-rays we possibly can. I had a CT scan about, 2 years ago? A certain portion of me, some doctor wanted to see it. Now I have a radiologist friend, a really close friend. We stop at their house whenever we're traveling, if that's the route we're going. And when he learned of that, he put his hands on his hips and he said, "Jim, that was 40 chest x-rays." I'll tell you what, these CT scans are a lot of radiation, and you should avoid them if you possibly can. The first CT scanner that was ever made had one x-ray beam. You know how it would go around and make little dots on the film all the way around, and then they would move it just to smidgens and do it again. Today, the CT scanners have over 500 beams all at the same time. A lot of radiation going on there, so we avoid it if we possibly can. Ask the doctors, there's any other way we can do this. Here's another interesting one when we speak of radiation. And I'm behind on the screen there. This list I just put up there on the right-hand side is just some of the tumor suppressor genes that we have found so far. And now we're looking at what causes mutations, and I said radiation was the next thing I wanted to talk about. Here's an interesting one. I think all of you have heard the word radon. Uranium deep in the bowels of the earth actually sends out little particles, radioactive, you know about that. But when that happens, that atom that did that becomes something else, which that's also radioactive. And when it flies out another little particle, it becomes something else. That's how you get radon. A couple of steps down, I don't know if you know this, uranium eventually will become lead. All the uranium in the whole earth will eventually turn into lead. There's nothing we can do about it. Step at a time. But the second step down, or is it the third one? I used to have it all memorized. It becomes a gas, a heavy gas, which nevertheless comes seeping up through the dirt, right through the concrete in your basement. And if you don't have a door in the basement, and even if you do, if it's not opened real often, the radon will build up to the bottom of the windows that you might open. And if their windows aren't open a lot, or there are no windows, it will fill the whole basement. 10,000 people every year die in this country from lung cancer caused by radon exposure. So, and there's a lot of, where I'm giving this presentation from in northeastern Washington State, there's a lot of uranium around these parts. I don't know this for sure, but I heard years ago there was a restaurant in Kettle Falls not far from where we lived called the Geiger Counter, because there's so much radiation because of the uranium. But the point is, all building codes today require people, when they pour a slab in the bottom of a house, you got to put pipes in there. I won't get into the details, so that you can get rid of it. So that's something important to know, though. If you have a basement, you ought to know how much radon is there. There are toxins that cause mutations. Remember, all cancers, no exception, caused by mutations in the DNA. And a good example is tobacco smoke. Tobacco has over, when you burn it, now in tobacco itself there aren't these poisons, but in tobacco smoke, because you've heated this to a very high temperature, there are over 5,000 poisons in tobacco smoke. And a number of them have the ability to mutate or alter DNA. And so everybody knows tobacco smoke's a big risk for cancer. There are many other toxins. Everybody knows about pesticides, and they don't want to eat food with pesticides on it. It's interesting. We could stop and talk about any one of these for a while. The studies have not shown that the population is getting cancer from pesticides. It has shown that the people working in the factories that get lots of exposure to it, even with protection, get cancer from some pesticides. People, I think, worry about that too much on the food that they eat because of the reason I just explained. Viruses can cause cancer. I'd love to get into detail on that. I want to look at things that we can do something about. By the way, what's the number one risk factor for cancer? Too many pounds. And you can do something about that if you're too heavy. Alcohol. Many people listening to this are not using alcohol. Many people are. Every drink increases the risk for cancers, various places in the body. Free radicals. Everybody has heard that term. You probably don't know a lot about it. A free radical is a chemical that has been oxidized, and now that chemical wants to go grab something from another chemical, and that can cause a mutation. One of the interesting things about the way Americans live is we're in the habit of taking oil out of an olive or taking it out of a peanut or out of some corn. As soon as you remove that oil, all the oils, with the exception of the two oils that are mostly saturated, that's palm kernel oil and coconut oil. All the rest of the oils, as soon as they're removed from wherever they came from, they start oxidizing, and there's free radicals there, and those free radicals are carcinogens. They mutate DNA and have the potential to cause cancer. It's amazing how uninformed Americans are about these kinds of things. And when you take that oil that's in the bottle, it's already oxidizing. If you put it in a frying pan and heat it to pancake frying temperature, you increase the oxidization over the rate at which it's being oxidized over 2 million times. It's insanity, the way we treat our bodies not knowing any better. Free radicals. Copy error. Oh, this is an interesting one. I usually do this on a blackboard. Every time a cell copies itself, and that happens when you have a little wound and it heals. That happens when you're growing, making more cells. Every time a cell copies itself, it has to make a copy of the DNA. And that copy, we didn't know this until fairly recently, has errors in it. In fact, the average number of errors is 1 out of every 1,000 rungs. And if you divide 3 billion, instead of saying 3,200,000,000, if you divide, just to make it simple, if you divide 3 billion by 1,000, you get 300,000 mistakes. Fortunately, these tumor suppressor genes come along and fix the mistakes. Wonderful. But they miss 1 out of 1,000 on average. So we still have 3,000 on average mutations every time a cell copies itself. And listen to this. In the female milk duct, there's a group of lobules, I have a picture of this somewhere else, that make the milk, and then the milk travels in a duct to the baby. There's a lining of cells in that milk duct that every time the female has a menstrual cycle, all those cells die in that lining, and just before they die, they copy themselves and make a new lining. 84% of breast cancer occurs in the milk duct. And we think, we're virtually certain, it's because of copy error. So here, I'll show you in a few minutes, there is a way for a young girl to delay the onset of menarche, maybe 5 years or more, so that she will miss about 60 cycles or more, making her at greatly reduced risk for cancer of the breast in the milk ducts. And the way they do that is to use plants for their food. So let's keep going here. We'll come to a little diagram on that if we get a chance here. So you have toxins, viruses, alcohol, free radicals, copy error, and so forth. I'm going to pass up this part because I've already described it. Estrogen, there's some false information about this. I think it's over 86% of breast cancers are what we call ER positive, estrogen receptor positive. And that means that that particular cancer, when it grabs onto estrogen, it grows faster. That's what we mean when we say that tumor is an ER positive tumor. You can have a PR positive tumor, an HER2 positive or negative, all three of those. So there's about 10 different kinds of breast cancers that we know about. But the interesting thing is, people were told that soy was bad for you and it would cause breast cancer or make it grow faster. That's totally wrong. Somebody got that idea. I would like to take 5 minutes on how that happened, but I'll just tell you, the research is absolutely clear. Because soy has estrogens in it too. We call them phytosterols. The estrogen that soy makes is not exactly like the estrogen that our bodies make, and men make it as well as women. Women make more. That estrogen is not exactly the same, but it actually, when that estrogen hooks up to a ER-positive tumor, it makes it grow slower, not faster. Amazing. And of course, inflammation is a problem with cancer. Everybody knows today that inflammation is bad, and mostly the way Americans live, it causes inflammation. The way we live, eat, sleep, and drink, and if you change all of that, you can reduce it greatly. Let's keep going. What about responsible drinking? Let's see, get this thing going. Here we go. Responsible drinking has become a 21st century mantra for how most people view alcohol consumption. But when it comes to cancer, no amount of alcohol is safe. That is the conclusion in the World Cancer Report. It's from the World Health Organization. And I've already mentioned this, so because of time, I'm going to slip through these slides rather quickly. Every drink is increasing our risk for cancer, and the risk is dose dependent. The more you drink, the higher the risk, and so on. I'd love to read all of this, but it's just underlining tremendously how dangerous alcohol is. And here's some conclusions. Excess body fat is a problem, and the evidence for obesity increasing the risk for cancer is convincing, and so forth. But physical activity reduces the risk for multiple cancers by contributing to weight control. It also reduces the risk of colorectal and breast cancer by other mechanisms. We won't get into them. The general consensus among researchers is that exercise should be of moderate intensity for about an hour each day. Now, I'm going to pass up some more of these slides. Just briefly say that diabetes is an increased risk for cancer. That's what these are saying. The high prevalence of prediabetes. You should know that if you have prediabetes, it is diabetes. And we need to do something about those to prevent the risk for cancer. Now, here is an amazing story. This is from the book, The China Study, by T. Colin Campbell and his son. This is a study that was done in China. I don't know if you know this, but Mao Zedong died of cancer. And before he died, he initiated a large study to see for his whole country what the incidence of all kinds of cancers were. And as a result of that data, Dr. Campbell and his cohort in China studied, listen to this, 800 million people. Nobody has ever done any study even close to that. The Chinese government hired thousands of workers. They would go and stay with people in their home for 4 days and write down everything they did, everything they ate, and so forth and so on. And this data was compiled, and I'm going to take the picture on the right and make it full screen. Each of these, there's over 1,000, I think, counties in the country of China. So each of these little areas that have a line is a county, and the darker they are, the more cancer there is in that county. And let me show you a kind of a summary of it. Males and females of about 8 different kinds of cancers, but they have a list that's much longer than this. I'm just putting a few on the screen. For example, take stomach cancer in males, about halfway down the chart. There's a 6 and a dash and a 386. The astonishing meaning of this is, in some counties, the incidence of stomach cancer is only 6 people out of 100,000 population. In other counties, the incidence is 386 people out of 100,000 population. Absolutely astonishing. An unbelievable increase. And I'll just put a few of the ratios on the screen for you. 14 times as much, 20 times as much, 35 times as much, 64 times as much, 75 times as much cancer, all based on lifestyle. In other words, somebody can live in such a way to be at that kind of risk, or live in such a way to be at the lower kind of risk. So it's an amazing story, the China study. Let me give you a couple of things that he said about it. Oh, I didn't put those numbers. I was watching them on my screen and not your screen, so I'm sorry about that. There they are, 64, 75 times as much cancer. Now here's what he wrote in the book. We found that what we found was shocking. Listen carefully, friends. Low protein diets inhibited the what? The initiation of cancer by aflatoxin, no matter how much of this carcinogen was administered to the animals. We found not all proteins had this effect. It was casein, which makes up 87% of cow's milk protein, which, notice this, folks, you've got to notice this, promoted all stages of the cancer process: initiation, promotion, and metastasizing. Remember that? The 3 stages of the cancer issue. This is astonishing, folks. We now know that cow's milk is a big risk factor for getting people to have cancer. I was raised on a ranch. I drank 3 glasses of milk at every meal for years. It's probably the reason that even though by the time I was 18, I became a vegetarian, and by the time I was 23, I was using only plants. See, some vegetarians use milk and eggs, or dairy products and eggs. It's crazy, folks. In spite of what the milk people tell you, this is a dangerous place to be. Let's keep going. And the cancer challenge is, the usual interpretation for carcinogens is that the effect is proportional to the dose and there's no threshold. But there is increasing evidence, this is very good news, that there is a limited threshold effect. And let me show you what this means. The idea is that if you expose the population to a certain amount of carcinogen, they get a certain amount of cancer. If you double the dose of the carcinogen, you double the amount of cancer found in the population. But we find that there is a threshold effect. And what that means is that in this case, the omega-6 oils, which are powerful promoters in both human and animal models of cancer in the breast, colon, prostate, and pancreas. Where do we get these omega-6 oils from? All these oils that we take out of the plant and put on our salads and in our muffins and in our pancakes and everywhere. It's insanity almost. We find that they are powerful promoters of cancer in these sites. It's absolutely astonishing. But listen to this. This is absolutely amazing. This promotion is only seen when the diet has 40, you don't have to tell me that anymore, I'm watching the clock, has 40% of the energy as fat, not when you have as low as 15 to 20% as fat. And let me explain what that means. You eat some food. There's only 3 sources of calories: fat, carbohydrate, protein. A percentage of it comes from fat, and so forth. And when you eat only plants, I taught nutrition in college classes for years and measured the students. If you eat only plants unrefined, you keep your caloric intake from fat below 20%. And this effect of producing cancer is not there when you keep the total calories from fat below that figure. It's absolutely amazing what we know today. Of course, Americans don't know this. And let's see if I can show you one other thing. This is absolutely astonishing. Using a macrobiotic diet, emphasizing whole grains, vegetables, legumes, and avoiding dairy products and most meats. Now, the program we promote is even better than this. But even on this program, they took a group of men. Actually, there were groups of 9 men with prostate cancer, had an average survival rate of 19 years, compared to another group of men with the same level of cancer, the same Gleason scores. These men only lived how long? 6 years. A matched group of men using the standard American diet. I was diagnosed with prostate cancer 20 years ago and told I had 5 years to live. that was following this thing on the bottom of the screen. I'm alive today, 20 years later. We can't find any cancer. I had a bone scan a year ago. They can't find any cancer anywhere. We know it's growing because my PSA is up. When you don't have a prostate, the only thing that makes PSA is cancer cells. So it's astonishing what Americans could do. See, the good news is about cancer, we can do a huge amount to prevent it. And we can do a great thing if we ever get it to make it grow slowly. Most preventable after lung cancer, because we can get about 90% of cancers taken care of by colonoscopies. I talked to you about this a little bit already. And the increased risk for breast cancer, early menarche, first childbirth after 35 years, no children at all, smaller number of children, later age at menopause, a family history of breast cancer, that was Angelina Jolie kind of thing, and the use of hormone replacement therapy. Do you know, I think it was in 2004. I'm driving home and I'm listening to the radio, and it just burst on the news that this Women's Health Initiative study had shown that hormone replacement therapy was increasing risk for breast cancer instead of maybe reducing it. And virtually overnight, 1/3 of the women taking hormone replacement therapy, actually it was more than 1/3, it was 35%, stopped using hormone replacement therapy. But what's going on with this story, folks, is the reason early menarche and no birth children and these various things are risk factors is because of the copy error that occurs in the milk duct with every menstrual cycle. You gals all know, and men probably know this too, that a woman doesn't cycle when she's pregnant. Actually, that does happen once in a great while. Nor does she cycle if she's nursing the child. So the more children that are born, the less, not only the less breast cancer, but the less of all these female reproductive organ cancers. It's just an astonishing world that we live in. And my time is nearly up, but eating a healthy diet, making sure you have enough folic acid, pregnancies, breastfeeding, normal weight, regular exercise, alcohol, if at all used in moderation, and of course avoiding x-rays. So the good news is, folks, there's a huge thing with prevention. There's a wonderful thing to make it grow slow. And this study was not just prostate cancer. These studies have been in a number of cancers, and they all show the same effect. It probably will turn out to be all cancers that grow slow when you use an unrefined, plant-based regimen. And I have a bunch of pictures I showed earlier in one of the programs you can see of all these wonderful foods we can make from plants. And when people say, where do you get your protein? I discussed that as well. Adequate protein, no problem. So there's good news, folks. If you will raise your right hand and repeat after me. No, that's okay. Make these changes, and you will be blessed with much better health and a greatly decreased risk of cancer.